In the year 260 AD, the world witnessed a sight that should have been utterly impossible. The Roman Emperor Valerian, the living, breathing embodiment of the Mediterranean's greatest superpower, did not fall in a glorious cavalry charge. He did not die by an assassin's blade in the marble halls of his palace. Instead, he knelt in the suffocating dust of the Syrian desert, his imperial purple robe stained with sweat and shame. Above him, mounted on a charcoal-black stallion, sat a man draped in silk and heavy iron, a crown of soaring wings upon his head. This was Shapur the King of Kings, and he had just done something no barbarian chieftain had ever dared. He took a Roman emperor captive alive, and according to legend, used him as a human footstool to mount his horse. For centuries, the popular narrative of history has told a very specific story. Rome fell because of internal decay and the relentless crushing tide of Germanic tribes from the dark forests of the north. We are taught that when the Western Empire finally collapsed, the light of antiquity flickered out, plunging Europe into the Dark Ages. But this narrative ignores a massive, glittering reality to the east. While Rome struggled with Goths and Vandals, it was locked in a 400-year deathmatch with the only civilization it ever truly considered an equal. This was the Sassanid Empire. They were not unwashed barbarians at the gates. They were a mirror image of Rome, a sophisticated industrial and hyper-militarized state that claimed the ancient legacy of the Persians. For 4 centuries, these two titans fought a high-stakes chess match across the deserts of Mesopotamia and the mountains of the Caucasus. It was a war of whispered diplomacies, devastating siege engines, and the most feared heavy cavalry the world had ever seen. This is the story of the empire Rome couldn't kill, and how their final apocalyptic struggle paved the way for a world neither of them could have ever imagined. To understand the Sassanids, we must look at the ashes from which they rose. For hundreds of years, Rome had fought the Parthians, a loose, decentralized confederation of horse lords who ruled the east. The Parthians were a thorn in Rome's side, famous for their hit-and-run archery, but they rarely posed an existential threat to the Roman state. They were too fractured, too prone to civil war. But in the early 3rd century, a man named Ardashir, a minor governor in the southern heartland of Persia, decided the old ways were finished. Ardashir didn't just want to rule a kingdom, he wanted a revolution. Claiming direct descent from the legendary Achaemenid kings, the dynasty of Cyrus and Darius, who had fought the ancient Greeks, Ardashir systematically overthrew his Parthian overlords. He forged a radical new identity for his people. He centralized the government, bound the state completely to the ancient Zoroastrian faith, and built a massive, professional standing army. When Ardashir looked west, he didn't see a peaceful neighbor. He saw a Roman thief occupying ancestral Persian lands. In 230 AD, he sent a message to the Roman Emperor Severus Alexander. It was a message that terrified the Roman Senate: hand over all of Asia, from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, or face annihilation. The Sassanid war machine had awoken, and the timing for Rome could not have been worse. The Roman Empire was entering what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year spiral of civil wars, plagues, and economic collapse. Just as Roman legions were busy killing each other to put their favorite generals on the throne, the Sassanids struck. Ardashir's son, Shapur the Great, proved to be a visionary of carnage. He realized that Roman strength lay in their disciplined heavy infantry and their fortified cities. So, the Sassanids mastered the one thing the Parthians never could: siege warfare. They built massive earthen ramps, diverted entire rivers to undermine city walls, and deployed heavily armored war elephants that acted like ancient tanks, shattering the disciplined Roman squares. But what truly struck fear into the hearts of the Roman legions was the Sassanid elite cavalry, the Savaran. These were cataphracts, men and horses entirely encased in scale armor, wielding massive lances. When the Savaran charged, they looked like a moving wall of iron. They didn't just break enemy lines, they pulverized them. It was this military innovation that led to the catastrophic Battle of Edessa in 260 AD, where Emperor Valerian's army was encircled and destroyed, leading to his unprecedented capture. The psychological trauma of a Roman emperor dying as a Persian captive sent shockwaves through the Roman soul. The empire actually fractured in the aftermath, splitting into 3 separate states just to survive the pressure. But Rome, true to its nature, refused to die. Decades later, under the brutal efficiency of Emperor Diocletian, Rome reorganized. They built a massive system of defense in depth across the eastern frontier. The border between the two empires, running roughly through modern-day Syria and Iraq, became the most heavily militarized zone on Earth. It was a scorched earth landscape of massive stone fortresses that changed hands dozens of times over the next century. Yet, as the decades bled into centuries, this conflict evolved into something strangely intimate. This was not a war of extermination like Rome fought against the Carthaginians. It was a rivalry of equals. The Roman and Sassanid emperors began to refer to each other in diplomatic letters as brother. They mutually understood that they were the two eyes of the world. There was a silent, terrifying agreement. If one eye was blinded, the chaos of the nomadic steppes would swallow them both. They even cooperated at times. When the dreaded Huns appeared in the Caucasus Mountains, Rome actually paid the Sassanids vast sums of gold to man the Darial Gorge, effectively paying their greatest rival to protect the civilized world from the terror of the steppes. But underneath the diplomatic niceties and the gold shipments, the fire of ambition never stopped smoldering. A fragile peace could only hold for so long when two empires claimed universal dominion. The tension finally snapped in the early 7th century, triggering what can only be described as the World War of Antiquity. It began when the Byzantine Emperor Maurice, who had actually helped the Sassanid king Khosrow II gain his throne, was murdered in a Roman military coup. Khosrow II saw his opportunity. Under the pretense of avenging his murdered Roman father, Khosrow launched an invasion of unprecedented scale. The Sassanid armies swept through the Levant like a tidal wave. They captured Antioch. They captured Damascus. In 614 AD, they took Jerusalem, burning the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and carrying off the True Cross, the holiest relic in the Christian world, back to their capital at Ctesiphon. It was a devastating moral blow. But Khosrow didn't stop there. His armies marched into Egypt, the breadbasket of the Roman world, cutting off the grain supply that fed the great metropolis of Constantinople. By 626 AD, Sassanid soldiers stood on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, looking across the narrow water at the gleaming walls of Constantinople itself. Allied with the Avars attacking from the European side, the Sassanids were poised to extinguish the Roman Empire forever. Rome was on the absolute brink of total annihilation, but Rome had one final, desperate champion, the Emperor Heraclius. Trapped in his besieged capital, bankrupt and starving, Heraclius did the unthinkable. He didn't stay to defend his walls. He took the last remaining field army of the Roman Empire, boarded them onto ships, sailed up the Black Sea, and landed deep in enemy territory. He launched a suicide mission directly into the Persian heartland. It was a masterstroke of strategic audacity. Heraclius bypassed the Sassanid armies at his gates and began burning Zoroastrian fire temples in the Persian homeland. He forced Khosrow to recall his armies from the Roman frontier to defend his own capital. In 627 AD, at the Battle of Nineveh, fought near the ruins of the ancient Assyrian capital, the Roman army finally crushed the Sassanid host. Khosrow II fled into the mountains and was eventually overthrown and executed by his own son. The Great War was over. By the time a peace treaty was signed in 628, restoring the old borders and returning the True Cross to Jerusalem, both empires declared victory. But it was the peace of the graveyard. They had spent their treasuries, burned their farmlands, and butchered a generation of their finest young men. They were exhausted, hollowed out by a century of constant mobilization and the ravages of the plague. As the battered Roman and Sassanid soldiers stood guard on their frontiers, leaning on their spears, they occasionally looked south, toward the harsh deserts of Arabia. To the emperors in Constantinople and Ctesiphon, the desert tribes were a nuisance, unorganized, poorly equipped, and entirely irrelevant to the great game of superpowers. They could not have been more wrong. In the 630s, fueled by the unifying fire of a new faith, Islam, and led by brilliant tacticians, the Arab armies surged northward out of the desert. They struck an ancient world that was already bleeding to death. The Sassanid Empire, fractured by a vicious civil war following Khosrow's death, and entirely lacking the strategic depth to replace its fallen professional elite, collapsed with startling speed. At the colossal Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, The legendary Sassanid war elephants were blinded and panicked, and the Savaran heavy cavalry, the Iron Knights who had held Rome at bay for 400 years, were finally broken. The last king of kings, Yazdegerd III, spent his final years as a hunted fugitive, retreating further and further east. He was eventually murdered in a remote mill by a local who didn't even recognize the fallen emperor, killing him just to steal his clothes. The Roman Empire survived the Islamic conquests, but it was mutilated, permanently losing its richest provinces of Egypt, Syria, and North Africa. It would spend the next 8 centuries as a much smaller, besieged state. The Sassanid Empire, however, vanished from the map forever. But it did not vanish from history. The sophisticated administration, the sprawling trade networks, the stunning architecture, and the deep philosophical traditions of the Sassanids didn't die. They were absorbed. The Islamic Golden Age, which would soon illuminate the world with advancements in science, medicine, and mathematics, was largely built upon the intellectual foundations of the Sassanid state. The great caliphs would soon rule from Baghdad, just a few miles from the ruins of the old Sassanid capital of Ctesiphon, using Sassanid methods to govern an empire that stretched from Spain to the borders of India. We easily remember Rome because its ruins stand proudly in Western cities, and its language is embedded in our own. But we must remember the Sassanids because they were the great crucible in which the Roman spirit was tested. They were the empire that proved Rome was not invincible, the rival that forced the Caesars to constantly evolve, and the civilization whose tragic apocalyptic fall changed the geopolitical map of the world more than any barbarian sack of Rome ever could. They were the forgotten superpower, the other eye of the world, and the only empire that Rome, despite all its fury and might, could never truly kill. The echoes of their 400-year war would shape the next millennium of human history. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's greatest forgotten rivalries, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden chapters of our past. What other forgotten empires or unsung rivalries do you think deserve their own video? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, remember that history is always larger than the map.